Diabetes Connections is brought to you by One Touch. Every touch is a step forward. By Dexcom, take control of your diabetes and live life to the fullest with Dexcom. By Tandem Diabetes Care, makers of the t:slim X2 insulin pump. And by Real Good Foods, real food you feel good about eating.
This is Diabetes Connections with Stacey Sims.
Welcome to a bonus episode of the show. You know we aim to educate and inspire about type 1 diabetes by sharing stories of connection. And this week, we really have the opportunity to take a mainstream big story and bring it to the diabetes community and maybe educate some people who are not in the diabetes community. Talking about Steele Magnolias. I'm putting this episode out there because Steele Magnolias is getting reissued in a lot of theaters across the country to celebrate, if you're my age, this is going to sound crazy, 30 years since the movie's release. Oh my gosh. Well, if you listen every week, you know that my son was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes right before he turned 2. He is now 14 years old. My husband has type 2 diabetes. I don't have diabetes, but I have a background in broadcasting, in local radio and television, and that's how you get the podcast. This episode features a roundtable that I did last summer all about Steele Magnolias. And that movie is really a touchstone, and, controversial one for many women, all about pregnancy and diabetes. I put this panel together last year because my local community theater was putting on the play. And Steele Magnolias, if you don't already know, it was first a play by Robert Harling based on the true story of his sister's death. And then they made the movie, the famous movie you're probably very familiar with, starring, Sally Field, Julia Roberts, Olympia Dukakis, Shirley MacLaine. Who else is in this movie? Dolly Parton. How could I forget Dolly Parton? Daryl Hannah. I mean, this is a movie that was just so well received at the time and continues to be much loved. It is obviously being reissued. There's a huge audience for it still. But I think it's really important to talk about in the diabetes community because the story of the woman, the Julia Roberts character based on Harling's sister who dies, that part of the story continues to be, for many, their only knowledge of pregnancy and type 1 diabetes. And while it's a true story, so much has changed in not only the 30 years since the movie came out, but in the time before that. I mean, you have to go back several years. And then, of course, she was probably diagnosed in the 60s. I don't know the whole story about the Harling family. I'll be honest, I love the movie. I really like Steele Magnolias. But the diabetes part of it, we need to talk about that. So the panelists are Melissa Lee, Kerri Sparling, and Kyrra Richards, all moms who live with type 1. They joined me to talk about the movie, their experiences in pregnancy, and their experiences now with their kids. So let me just tell you a little bit more about them. Melissa Lee is the Director of Community Relations for Bigfoot Biomedical. She is the mother of 2 children and was diagnosed with type 1 in elementary school. Kerri Sparling writes 6 Until Me, the wonderful blog that she's wrapping up this month. We're going to have more on that in another episode. Kerri was diagnosed at 7 after 6 years without diabetes, 6 Until Me. She has 2 children now. And Kyrra Richards created and heads up Myabetic, which makes beautiful, fashionable bags with diabetes in mind. She was diagnosed as an adult. And when we taped this interview last year, she had 1 baby and she was pregnant with her second. She now has 2 beautiful kiddos. All right, this podcast is not intended as medical advice. If you have those kinds of questions, please contact your healthcare provider. Now, let's talk about Steele Magnolias. Kerri, Melissa, and Kyrra, thank you so much for joining me. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's start. If you all remember, do you remember seeing this movie? Did you already have diabetes? Kerri, let me start with you. How did Steele Magnolias kind of come into your life?
Well, I didn't know what it was about when we first sat down to watch it. So my mom and I think I was 11 or so at the time, and we sat down. We're like, oh, there's this mainstream representation of type 1 diabetes in a movie. We didn't call it that, but that's like what I would call it now. We said, cool, let's make some popcorn. Let's sit down and watch it. This all sounds awesome. Nobody gave us any context as to what we were jumping into. And so I didn't know that the character with type 1 diabetes, the Julia Roberts character, gets pregnant and then as a result of complications from her pregnancy ends up dying. And so my mom and I were halfway with popcorn to our mouths watching this funeral scene with Sally Field and all the other characters, and they're sobbing and crying, and we were not prepared for that. And this was before you could go onto IMDb and see what the movie was about in the first place. So it set the stage for like, wow, no, I thought that everyone said that pregnancy with diabetes was maybe not a great idea, but I didn't know that this is what they were always picturing in their head. And so it wasn't always it was always the thing I was fighting against instead of like absorbing and believing was true, even though it is a true story.
Did you and your mom finish watching it?
I don't even remember. There's this weird part of my whole physical being that like blocked all that out.
Melissa, how about you? Did you watch it when you had type 1?
Well, so the movie came out less than a year before I was diagnosed. And I hadn't seen it. It wasn't the type of movie that my parents would have taken us to. So I had no knowledge of this movie. But when I arrived, I was diagnosed during the summer before my 5th grade year. And when I arrived back into my classroom, my best friend in the class looks at me and bursts into tears. And if you try to have a baby, you're going to die. And I was like, I'm sorry, what? Because everything that had been said to me at diagnosis by my fantastic endocrinologist at Children's Medical Center of Dallas had been like, oh, and diabetes isn't what it once was. And if you have any concerns about whether or not she'd ever be able to have children, that's not a concern anymore. And like, we've really come beyond that. And so I was 10 years old. I was like, okay, sounds great. I'm ready. And so to have my friend break down in front of me, I'm like, what is this movie she's talking about? And so when I finally did sit down in front of the movie, I think it was many years later because I think I kept it at arm's length because I was like, I don't know that I can figure all that out. Mm-hmm. And then when I finally saw it, I remember being so angry in a way that I can't, like, seriously, people bring this movie up in conversation. I just get mad unreasonably because I'm so upset with that being the model that people have. Like, there's no antithesis of that. And so I've seen it a couple times in my life, and it always leaves a really sick feeling in my stomach.
Kyrra, let me ask you the same question. Do you remember seeing it?
So I was not aware of this movie. When I was diagnosed, I was an adult. So I had never seen the movie. I hadn't really heard about the movie. But after I was diagnosed, I heard that there was some movie with Julia Roberts and Sally Field, and there contained some diabetes misconceptions. But I've never seen it, and so I just watched the movie. And I do not recommend watching this film when you are pregnant with diabetes.
You just watched it like now, like recently?
I just watched it because I had never heard of it. I was like, well, I should probably watch this film.
Oh, my God.
So while I'm hormonal and pregnant, this was a very tough film to get through.
Well, it's funny because to me, and I'm in my mid-40s, this is a movie that I feel like everybody's seen, everybody's heard of, everybody knows about. But I looked it up, and, it came out in 1989, which might as well be 100 years ago. And it's also portraying a side of diabetes that the author experienced at least 10 to 15 years. It's based on a true story with his sister, but 10 to 15 years before the movie was even made. So it's difficult, Melissa. As you said, there's really no other as big movie as this. I mean, look at all the stars that are in this movie that has been made since then that we can point to and say, yeah, but since then, this has happened. Is that part of the frustration, you think?
Yeah, I would also add that, they keep updating the movie or the play. I know when I was a high school teacher, the high school theater department did it. I know there was an updated version that was much more racially diverse. But what's interesting is that because the drama that happens to the character of Shelby and that ends up, becoming the sort of tragedy, the linchpin of what brings all these women together and shows their strength, they don't change that. Mm. And so, they're updating for, diversity, they're updating for situation and time and all this stuff. But this fundamental aspect has remained unchanged since the author first wrote the play about his sister.
So, Kerri, when you then decided to start a family, did you think about your endocrinologist advice saying that it's okay to get pregnant? Or was this kind of in the back of your mind thinking, drink the juice, Shelby? Was that something that you heard in your head?
When all I'm certain of is that when my husband and I were thinking about starting a family, that there were two names that we were not going to name our kids. One was Shelby and the other one was Jackson. Like, these names were just banned. And I'm sure those are great names and there are plenty of people with that great name, but like, those two names were off the table as far as we were concerned. But like, no, it wasn't completely top of mind because by the time that I was thinking about having children, I'd already heard about Nicole Johnson, who had successfully had a baby, and I'd met her several times. And I'd met her child several times. So like the story was starting to change, and my mental image of what a pregnancy with diabetes could become was shifting away from that one old school, partially dramatized version of it into something that was more realistic. No, it wasn't easy, but yes, it was doable. No, it wasn't banned, but yes, it was recommended to do a lot of planning. So I went into it thinking this is going to be really, really hard. And I've yet to meet a person who is pregnant, diabetes notwithstanding, who is like, oh, this was so easy. Like the pregnancy on its own is not easy. But I had enough people saying if you prepare and you have the right medical team and you're as on it as you can be, you have great chances of having a very successful pregnancy. And I really took that to heart because there's no reason why my hope should be diminished by a movie, despite the fact, like I said, that it's true.
That's a great point. And Melissa, let me ask you kind of the same question. I mean, you have, your kids are now 8 and 6 years old. Were you thinking about Steele Magnolias at all? I mean, was it the back of your mind, or was it just the kind of thing that, well, it's just a movie?
Well, again, it is more than a movie because it was someone's real life. But in my mind, it was so stuck in the time that it originally happened that I'm going to go back to my anger. I would hear people say these things to me, and I was so adamant. I'm like, that's not reality today, or it doesn't have to be, at least. I mean, let's be honest, it may be someone's reality today based on their access or their support system, but it is not the way that all pregnancy with diabetes goes down. And so I found that I just stuck to my guns. I dug my heels in more. The more people would bring this up, I would say, no, that's not how it's going to be. So I spent my pregnancy sort of fighting this stigma and I would say that I never actually secretly feared that. I put my energy into trying to sort of use my pregnancy as a proof point to others to be like, I can do this. Watch guys. I have exactly the information I need to do this. Everybody calm down.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny because it is a lot about other people. And as you said, Kerri, being pregnant isn't easy without diabetes, but people are also nosy and give you advice and tell you stuff without diabetes. But when Benny was diagnosed, a bunch of my friends alluded to this movie, which was their only real knowledge of type 1, and said, well, at least he's not a girl. At least you know that he's not going to, you don't have to worry about him getting pregnant or wanting to, and he can. And I remember thinking at the time, like, he's 2. I can't think about anything right now. But that was what people said to me. Kyrra, did you have anything? I mean, you're younger, than me, certainly, and you talked about never seeing this movie before. Is it still out there? Did people mention it to you when you were pregnant?
Not so much, a couple times, but because I'm a bit younger and because I was diagnosed as an adult and haven't gone through it as long, I'm very glad that I'm ignorant, really, about the subject. And because when I was diagnosed, I was fortunate enough to have these amazing conferences and social media. So I had already seen Melissa and Kerri successfully with children and a lot of other influencers sharing their life as moms and as pregnant women. So I was lucky that was my first example versus this movie.
Well, and let's change gears and talk about that because Melissa, you mentioned, there's really no antithesis to this movie, and I was gonna bring this up, Kyrra. I'm so glad you did because I think you too, especially Melissa and Kerri, have become that. There are a lot of women online. Kerri, you said Nicole Johnson, Miss America. Just being a healthy type 1, a person with type 1, and having a baby can really speak volumes. I'm curious, what's it like, Kerri, to hear from other people who now look at you as that example?
We'll get Kerri's answer to that question in just a moment. But first, handwriting your blood glucose levels is the ultimate throwback. The OneTouch VarioFlex meter seamlessly syncs with the free OneTouch Reveal mobile app to create your dynamic electronic logbook. And when you choose the OneTouch Reveal mobile app, you'll be joining thousands of other people living with diabetes. In fact, Research to Guidance found that OneTouch Reveal was the #1 downloaded diabetes management app in the U.S. in 2017. To upgrade today to the OneTouch VarioFlex meter and OneTouch Reveal mobile app, visit diabetes-connections.com and click on the OneTouch logo. Now back to Kerri talking about being a role model now to others.
I'm very careful about that because There were some things with my second pregnancy that I was unaware of for my first pregnancy. When I got pregnant with my daughter, it was a very easy process. I had Steele Magnolias perhaps in the back of my head, but it was like way back there. But I was able to get pregnant and stay pregnant and have my child start to finish while just worrying about the diabetes stuff. And so when people would talk about wanting to have children, I felt like I could talk about how I successfully got pregnant. Look, you can do it too, and everybody's going to be okay. And it wasn't until I had trouble conceiving my son and experienced a miscarriage before I got pregnant with my son and went through a lot of fertility issues in order to bring our son into the world that I was like, wait a minute. It's not just about telling everybody that they're going to be okay, because I have no idea. As Melissa had mentioned before, like, I don't know what someone's access circumstances are or what their family history is like. And so it's not just as easy as you can have a healthy pregnancy too, guys. All you have to do is have 2 thumbs up and see your endocrinologist and have an A1C of whatever. And so the struggles of a healthy pregnancy fell into a much broader context the second time. So when people talk to me about their hopes of a pregnancy or how they perhaps maybe like drew some inspiration from stories like mine or Melissa's or Nicole Johnson's, I like to try to temper that with the reality of, like, stuff happens. Things are always fluid and always a little bit risky in their own right. And so I try to be hopeful for those people, but I never tell them you can absolutely do this. I never make what I would consider a mistake of saying it's something that you too can achieve, because you never know what's going to be the stopping point for other people. So those conversations have gotten a little more nuanced as I've gotten older. But if someone's thinking of Melissa instead of Shelby from Steele Magnolias, like, I'm all for that. Let's change the narrative as much as we can. It's just I try to be gentler about it.
Well, that's a good point. And Melissa, let me ask you about that. Because saying to someone who has type 1 diabetes, you know, you can have a healthy pregnancy just like anybody else can have a healthy pregnancy, which also means stuff happens. And, I had a lot of trouble in between my 2 kids. I don't talk about that a lot. But it's not... it's not like snap your fingers and it all happens, although with some people it is, and that's wonderful. But, Melissa, you brought up access too. I think it's really important to keep those points in mind, even as we try to be more positive and tell, a 10-year-old girl diagnosed today, you can do this.
I had trouble conceiving my first, and so those things were, and it wasn't related to type 1 diabetes that I know of, and I felt like, again, I just seemed to sort of stay in defense mode a lot. As, I had family members who were saying, well, maybe you just shouldn't try. And so I was constantly trying to prove that it was a possibility. But during that same time that I was trying to conceive, I was part of a really active and wonderful and warm and just great subgroup on 2diabetes.org. At the time, it was called the Oh Baby group. And it was for women who had questions about pregnancy or had been through pregnancy or were pregnant. And it was just all women who were basically like stumbling around in the dark and happened to bump into each other at the stroller convention or something, right? And it was, you could see people who were just a few steps ahead of you, and you could also see people who had experienced loss, and you could see people who came in, and the very first question out of their mouth was, my doctor and my mom and my aunt and my grandma say I can't do this. And there you have to stop and realize that that's the opportunity, is to get in front of that stigma and that belief of, why have they said that to you? Is it based on the movie? Is it based on an old wives' tale? Is it based on a misunderstanding? What tools do you have? And you could talk to someone and find out that, no, I mean, they had just, a doctor or a well-meaning grandma had just laid the law down and said this wasn't a possibility for you. And so you could talk people through exploring what their options were. And you could say, well, look, this person had a successful pregnancy, and don't discount it. And so that was the difference for me, is not that I ever felt like I was saying, I did it, you can do it, but more like, why do you think you can't? We need to explore that. We need to explore what's informing that, because maybe there's a way that you can. And at the same time, there are many women who make the decision to not have children based on that information. And if that's what they want for their lives, then absolutely more power to them. If they never saw themselves as a mother, or they really wanted to adopt instead, that's fantastic. But at the same time, I always struggle to see decisions based in fear or misinformation.
What was that? Was it a chat room? Can you repeat what that was? I know it's probably not there anymore. I'm just curious.
It's not there anymore, unfortunately. It was sort of like we have Facebook groups today. It was a group specifically for pregnancy on the 2Diabetes platform. But to that end, there are pregnancy groups today. I'm in several still. I think I'm in 3 or 4 now on Facebook that are groups for women with pre-existing diabetes, that it's pregnancy or moms.
Kyrra, let me ask you, when you decided to have children, did you get any blowback from relatives? As Melissa said, was anybody kind of like, oh, be careful, anything like that?
No. I have very supportive friends and family. And again, I think that sometimes when you're diagnosed as an adult, I've always been the one taking care of myself versus a parent helping me throughout my childhood. So I have always been the first and the one in control of my diabetes versus a relative. I think that because of that, though, I think I was the most scared out of everybody. I knew, as I think Melissa and Kerri have expressed before, that I've always wanted to have kids. So it wasn't even a decision. It was like, I'm going to have kids no matter what. Whatever I have to do, via adoption, surrogacy, anything, I wanted to have kids. That was not something that I would miss in my life. But I think just like no two people with diabetes are alike and their management is alike, I mean, no two pregnancies are alike. So even though I was able to go to conferences and via social media talk to other women with diabetes and who have had successful pregnancies, you still kind of have doubts in the back of your head. For instance, when I started my insulin pump, I would get kind of these scars on my belly, and I would go to my pump company, and the nurses there, they would say, oh, what are these caused from? And they said, oh, you know what? I've never seen that scar before. And you kind of feel like you're the exception. Right. So it's like you still kind of have those doubts, like, well, if I got pregnant, maybe there's something else. Maybe, oh, no, I'm the only one that hit 350 in the middle of my pregnancy, and having to reach out to friends in the community. And thankfully, there were tools when I first got pregnant to do so. That was very helpful. But I still think that I was probably the most fearful out of everyone, and everybody else was like just kind of, Kyrra's confident, she can do it, but you're always a little scared in the back of your head.
And Kyrra, I should have asked you this earlier. I appreciate you coming on. This is our first time talking to you for Diabetes Connections. When were you diagnosed with type 1? How did you, what was that like?
I was almost 25. I was a professional dancer in Los Angeles. I'm still here in Los Angeles. But I had been dancing and touring military bases in Afghanistan. Wow. I came back from Afghanistan, a tour, and had, just kept having to go to the bathroom and thought something was wrong with my bladder, and went to the doctor thinking I did something or injured something dancing in Afghanistan, and that was the diagnosis instead. So I was 24 years old. So that was in 2008.
And you got the correct diagnosis right then?
I didn't. They suspected because I was an adult, it might be type 2. They couldn't tell, and so they had to do a bunch of testing. So I went actually to a class for type 2s at the time, and they were telling us, diet and exercise. And they actually said when I was there, I would really recommend that all of you try to walk one time around the block this week. And here I was, like, dancing 10 hours a day, going, well, what do I do? So, no, they thought I had type 2 at first, and then, yes, got the test results back.
Wow. So let me get nosy, Kyrra, if I could. How are you? How are you doing?
Yeah.
How are you feeling? I mean, you're making time, and I don't know how you have time. You have a toddler, barely 16 months, is still baby, and you're due in October. How are you doing?
I think, like any mom, just taking it a day at a time. I'm still working full-time on my diabetic business, and then have the little one, and then have this baby. And, I'm very excited, and every day is something new and exciting. This pregnancy, I've shared that it's very different from my first pregnancy. The first one, I think, went a little bit easier, and this time my first trimester was incredibly nauseous, which made it tougher to control my blood sugars, and they were going up and down and all over the place, and then obviously chasing after a toddler as well. So that's been different this time.
Let me ask you, I'll throw this out there, whoever wants to grab it can, and it's kind of personal, but I remember when I was pregnant, you'd kind of overeat, or I would do something. All right, I ate like a lot of mini chocolate donuts when I was pregnant with my daughter, but I'd feel kind of guilty, I'd be like, oh, I gained all this weight and I shouldn't have. And how hard is it? I don't know if you can even quantify it,
when you're pregnant
Oh my God,
and you're
Stacey.
seeing blood sugars going bananas. And I've heard it said that. Oh, you're all laughing. But, I have a teenage son, and I can't believe how high his blood sugar gets and how much insulin he needs now. And I've heard from several people like, well, when you're pregnant, you won't believe how much insulin you need and how crazy it can get. Melissa, let me start with you. Can you share any of that? I mean, the feelings, the guilt and the concern, it must be so difficult.
Oh, God. And it was, and like Kyrra, my second pregnancy was just so much harder. I, too, was chasing a toddler. My kids are 2 years apart, and I was chasing a toddler who I should add has ADHD. And my first pregnancy, I felt like I could focus so much more on the pregnancy. I had a standard deviation that was like 18, which means that my blood sugars really didn't vary much. And I, ate more consistently, and everything was on like clockwork. And the second one, life had happened, and I had this other child, and I had a different schedule, and I didn't have the same structure. And I distinctly remember craving a cheeseburger, going through a drive-thru, getting the cheeseburger, and then driving home. And then before I hit home, going through another drive-thru and eating the first cheeseburger in the drive-thru while I ordered the second cheeseburger. At the same time that you're like, I need to be eating on, with my first, I would get hungry every hour and a half. And the only way I could keep the nausea, subdued was to actually eat. So, I ate so much carb-free snacks. I think my baby was half string cheese by the time I was done. But with the second one, the blood sugar management was harder. The cravings are different with the different kids. And when you're the pregnant lady eating the cheeseburger in the drive-thru while you order the cheeseburger, you do start to question your life choices. And then the guilt on top of that comes from the blood sugar management, where, the nice thing about a successfully managed pregnancy with diabetes is that you're on top of all the numbers. So when you see a number, you can do something about it. And then you see another number maybe an hour later, maybe 15 minutes later, and you're constantly on it. But there's also then so many more opportunities for you to have that guilt and judgment. Oh my God, what have I done to the baby? Oh my God, what have I done to the baby? Yeah. When, I was lucky to really have a great support team in my healthcare providers who said things like, Melissa, you still have type 1 diabetes. Like, you can't make that go away. You're going to have fluctuations in your blood sugar. Are you on top of it? Are you treating it? So.
Yeah, you need that. Kerri, did you have those? You had to have had those feelings. I can't imagine.
I'm sorry. I'm still I'm trying to mentally write Melissa's memoir in my head, and I'm calling it the cheeseburger redundancy because that just sounds
such a great story.
That is so mentally where I went all the time. I hated diabetes the most after I had the baby, but I think I was the most forgiving about all the different things I did wrong or right during my pregnancies, because it was the first time in my life that diabetes there was like an end game to the whole thing. The diabetes is forever, and that's great, but diabetes with pregnancy is 40 weeks max. So there was no way that I had to do this micromanagement nonsense for more than 40 weeks. There was no way I had to fret about every blood sugar for more than 40 weeks. Like, there was a light at the end of the tunnel, and that made it easier for me to do all the things I had to do, because I knew if I really needed to, I could slide into burnout all on my own once that baby was out healthy and safely. And that's not like now just go and forget about everything after you have your baby. But the reins loosen up an awful lot once the baby has escaped my body. And so, but the guilt of every 200 wasn't my 200. It belonged to me and my kid. And I felt like I was baking the baby. It made me crazy. And then at the same time, my pregnancy care wasn't anywhere near where my home was. And so I live in Rhode Island, and I sought all of my pregnancy and maternal fetal medicine care up in Boston. So I was looking at an hour and a half commute without traffic. And anyone who lives anywhere near Boston knows that if you say the phrase without traffic, people collapse into giggles, because that is not a thing. There's always traffic. And so my commute to go see the clinicians was 3 hours sometimes. And so by my third trimester, I was going up 3 times a week, making a 6-hour round trip commute. I knew every bathroom between here and the Longwood Medical Center in Boston by heart. And I think I made it stressful more for myself by making that commute, but that was also where I knew the best medical care for where I lived would come from. So it was just stress upon compounded stress. And then I knew I was having C-sections. So there was this weird relief once I got to go home with the baby, and everyone looked at me and said, aren't you freaked out? You've got this newborn. I'm like, newborn? Man, I've got this. The whole pregnancy thing was a rotten mess, and I hated every minute of it. But when that child was born and my second was born, I was like, this is exactly why we do all this bananas stuff, so that we can have these kids. They are worth every minute. And when they're crawling all over me and yelling at me and making a mess of my house, I try to remind myself of how grateful I felt when I got to hold them after all of that, because there's just no greater journey for such a great reward.
I'm going to channel that thought later when I have to poke my head into Leah's room. My daughter, she's gone. She's gone to a camp program, and I asked her to clean up her room before she left, and there's no way it happened, and I'm terrified to go in there. I'll think about that. But she was so cute when we brought her home. Kyrra, do you have a cheeseburger moment in your first or second pregnancy?
Oh, God.
I love that story.
Well, let's just say that I'm sitting at my dining table with like an empty McDonald's bag. So you guys are telling, and I'm like cracking up. I have literally like 2 burger wrappers here. So thank you for speaking directly to my heart. Yeah. And on that same thing, going to the bathroom every 5 seconds, I was laughing because especially this one, I've had to go to the bathroom way more than my first one, and I'm going all the time, and it clues to me when I have to pee all the time that I have high blood sugar, and I'm going every time I go to the bathroom, oh no, and that, no, it's pregnancy, it's not diabetes, and trying to figure that out has been an adventure as well.
Yeah, that's interesting, because maybe you have type 1 if you're peeing so much. But obviously, sorry.
Exactly.
Does anybody ever confuse you all with like having gestational diabetes? Was that something that came up when you were pregnant?
Oh, my aunt asked me if it was going to go away after I had the baby, and I was like, "You've known me for multiple decades. How are you asking that question?" But I tried to pretend like it was cool. I'm like, no.
Yeah, I got asked the oddest question where a woman looked at me and she said, "Isn't it great how diabetes goes into remission during pregnancy?" And I looked at her and I was like, remission? Do you mean transmission? Like, do you mean like up to 11? Like, do you have no idea what I'm dealing with over here with micromanagement? Yeah. So, lots of, and then of course you're going to be asked by someone, whether well-meaning or not, is your baby going to have diabetes?
Oh.
And so that question comes up. I mean, it came up for me in both pregnancies.
Wow. There's a stopper for you. I mean, that's probably a different show altogether. But, is that... All right, we'll go down that. You brought it up. We're going to go down that rabbit hole. You had to have thought of it during your pregnancy. Melissa, let me start with you. Obviously, it didn't keep you from having children, but it had to have been on your mind.
In certain circles, we call it the thought, as though it's like a capital letter and has the quotes around it. It's the thought, and it doesn't go away. For some people, it's really pervasive and causes a great deal of anxiety. For other people, I would put myself on the other end of the spectrum of, you know what, we'll deal with it as it comes. And I sort of like toughen up and say, well, who better to deal with it should it come? But I think you would not be human if you weren't thinking about it, because this is one of the great burdens of your own life. And so just as you wonder, will my child inherit my eye color? Will my child inherit my fantastic personality or whatever it is you're worried about? You're thinking about, will my child inherit a burden that I carry, and will it then be my fault? Or will a child inherit a burden as large as the burden that I carry, and how will we work through that? And I think that that's not unique to a pregnancy with diabetes. I think that's probably pregnancy, especially with any other chronic disease. But it is a reality, and I think everyone thinks it.
Yeah. Kerri, do you want to take a crack at that one too?
Yeah, because I get asked that question at every single conference I've been to since the birth of my daughter, every single one. And the question is always well-intentioned, and people never mean to upset me, but it makes my eyes well up every time. And it's not because I'm not strong enough to handle whatever may come and all that sort of thing, but just the idea of, like, my daughter had ketotic hypoglycemia, and so I've seen her have 2 low blood sugars, and seeing the pain that I know the most intimately reflected in my own kid was almost a little too much to handle in the moment. And so I know if there became a thing like that was more permanent, I'm sure we could manage it, but it makes me feel very minimized. Like the joy of my pregnancy and of my children gets sucked out because people want to know if they're going to get sick too. And it's just this immediate heartbreak. And it makes me very sad, and also really makes me mad all in the same swoop. And so when I was pregnant with my son, after I'd been asked this a bunch of times when I was, after I had my daughter, I asked my mom, I was like, Mom, I get asked this question all the time. And every single time I almost burst into tears. And then I have to excuse myself to go to the bathroom afterwards so I can make sure I still look like a human. Am I crazy for getting this upset when people ask me this? And she was like, no, this makes total sense. This is the love of a mother. She gave a lot of really good answers. But what she said that really stuck with me was, do you think your life isn't worth living? And I'm like, well, no, I never questioned that. I feel, diabetes is a pain in the butt, but I like my life. I feel like I'm doing well and I enjoy being alive. So yeah, why do you ask that? She's like, well, so if anything comes up for your son or your daughter, it doesn't take away anything from their joy and their purposeful existence and all that sort of stuff. And the way that she phrased it was like in that magic mom way that made it, my mom's really good at taking me off the ledge, but like the way that she said it and the way her eyes looked when she said it just really stayed with me, that it's like, yeah, that's no matter what happens, whether it's diabetes or anything else, this was worth it. Every moment of this was worth it. And I have to remind myself of that. And I know friends who have had all kinds of different issues with their children. Some among my worst nightmares are things that could happen as a parent. Right. But I still know that child in their life is and was worth all of it. And so I really try to go back to that and keep that as a cemented thing. If I were able to have a hamburger in each hand every time somebody asked me that question, I feel like it would be a lot easier. But like, Melissa, that's my new mission. Double the burger, the pain.
It's true though, and it's not at all the same. But I've been asked many times, are you worried about your daughter, developing type 1? And I'm in the camp of, right, well, it would be horrible. We'll deal with it. But Benny's a great kid. I mean, he's a pain. He's a normal 13-year-old, and he was a crazy toddler. But he's fine. He says, I don't know. That's another conversation too as a parent. Go ahead, Melissa.
I was going to say, add this to all the intrusive questions that women who are pregnant get asked. Yes. I mean, it's the equivalent of the reaching out and rubbing your belly, and you're like, please stop it. That's mostly cheeseburgers.
1, 2 cheeseburgers.
Yeah, but it's true. I think, and Kerri hit the nail on the head too. People want to protect themselves. Like, what did you do? How can I avoid doing that so I'm safe? Or, if you're not worried about this, maybe I don't have to be worried about it. And so when you are leaders in the community, in any community, you I think you'll get those questions over and over again because it's such a natural urge of others. We want to protect ourselves, right? We want to make sure that everything's okay, even when it's out of our control. So, Kerri, we were just talking about, people wanting to rub your tummy and doing things like that. Your business is in diabetes. I mean, you talk to people all day with Diabetic, with the type 1 folks, and I'm sure that you go into that community a lot. What do you find people talk to you about? Do they want to know about your baby, about your pregnancy, or because it's online, are you largely kind of, an unknown?
What's funny is that I do. My job is in diabetes, but I personally am much more private about my diabetes, which is weird that I chose to go into something that I kind of ended up being in the center of and talking about my diabetes, because I don't think I would have chosen to do it that way. But because I do have this platform, I do feel a little bit more of a responsibility to show and to share things. Even with the team for Mother's Day is when I kind of explained or came out to the Diabetic audience that I was pregnant, mostly because I do these videos from our office and I'm going, okay, there's only going to be so much time that I hide a big belly, especially because my belly is way bigger this time, so I probably should address it. But it was something that I would have remained private about, but I thought, especially as social media has changed and my Diabetic is largely about kind of the image of diabetes and misconceptions and trying to change the image to something positive. I had been working before Diabetic as a dancer and a model in Los Angeles and doing a lot of photo shoots and things like that. And so I had always wanted to do a pregnancy photo shoot before I had diabetes. It was just something that I thought would be a fun thing to do. And then when I actually got to the point of my, within the second trimester and going, okay, all my friends that are pregnant are doing these shoots, but I don't feel necessarily as glamorous that I have my Dexcom and I have my pump. But, I was like, you know what? I feel like some kind of responsibility to share this and put it out somewhere on the Diabetic channels to display my belly with my pump and my CGM and all of it, because I had just never seen it. I had heard a lot of people talk about it and really share through words, but it had never been a visual statement. And I was very freaked out. to share that on social media and put it on a website. I'm going, again, because I just don't talk about it that often with friends or people outside the diabetes community. I never go, hi, my name is Kyrra and I have diabetes. That's just not something that I would normally do. And I put it out there, and it was just surprising how many people reached out and said, oh my gosh, thank you. Oh my goodness, you can still be kind of sexy with diabetes and pregnancy, which first of all, I did not feel sexy at all on that shoot. So I'm glad that came across to everybody else, but I was like, okay, yeah, thanks. But it was something that it kind of reminded me that, put it out there, and I'm glad to talk about all the negatives as well. But it was some kind of a platform that I thought I should share this experience with, and the visual side of it too, just what it might look like for someone with diabetes to be pregnant.
That's fantastic. Does Diabetic make a diaper bag?
Well, we've just developed this tote that we named after our good friend Kerri Sparling. So the Kerri Diabetes tote is available, and it's what I use as my diaper bag. It has all these sections it's perfect for it. So I put everything in there, and it works well. But we get that question and that request a lot, which just every time I hear it makes me so happy, to have a specific diabetes diaper bag.
I'll also add that I use it as my diaper bag as well, and my daughter calls it the mom bag.
Oh,
there you go.
That's some accidental product placement there. I'm glad I asked.
Yeah, I'd like to add that I don't carry a diaper bag anymore, which is awesome because my kids are 8 and 6, but I do carry only Diabetic.
Well.
Oh, well, thank you. I got to spend more time on this podcast.
When Benny was diagnosed, I have to say one of the things that went through my brain was, my daughter is 3 years older, so we stopped carrying the diaper bag. Then I had him. And we were just about to stop carrying the diaper bag, and he got diagnosed. And I was like, you've got to be kidding me. Now I have to schlep all this stuff everywhere again? It was one of the things that I could not get rid of the damn bag. I don't know why that upset me almost more than the actual diabetes at the time. Maybe if I'd had the Kerri, it would be a different story.
There you go.
All right, holds many cheeseburgers, that bag.
All right, before we devolve into the Hamburglar and hiding food in our purses, let's wrap this up by any advice. I know you've been giving it throughout here, even though you think you may not have been. I think there are going to be a lot of people listening to this podcast, this episode in particular, who are hoping to be pregnant soon, who are moms who are hopeful that their young adult daughters will have a positive experience if they'd like to have children at some point. That great group that you mentioned, Melissa, really doesn't exist, but there are all sorts of other ways to get support. Kerri, let me start with you. What should people do if they're thinking, okay, this was a great conversation, I want more, I need support?
Well, I guess maybe if you want to flip the whole thing way back to where we started, sit down and watch Steele Magnolias and just really get your SADs on, and then realize that it's not like that anymore, and that the narrative around a pregnancy with diabetes has completely changed, and you don't have to go and find a celebrity pregnancy in order to find your peers to identify with. You can just go onto the internet or go onto different message boards or blogs or websites or whatever, and you're going to find real life examples of people who have walked that walk, or at least some version of it, whether they're carrying their own biological child, or if they've gone scienced up a baby in a different way, and however things are happening, the pursuit of parenthood is achievable, and it's not this story that you have to go and really hunt down. It's out there, and I think that's the best part of what's changed from when I was diagnosed in 1986 to when kids or young women are diagnosed now, is that the things that it used to be like a diagnosis of you can't eat this, and you can't do that, and you can't have this, and you can't have that. And instead, it's become a diagnosis of you can, comma. And then after that comma comes this caveat of maybe the things you'll need to plan for, other things you'll have to think about. But the end of the sentence is you can't. And so there's this sort of changed narrative that people in the community they've changed the way that diabetes is perceived and presented across the world. And we're showing people that the life that can be found after diagnosis isn't this whole list of crap you can't do. There's all kinds of things you can do, including parenting. I mean, Kyrra right now is sitting here pregnant with her second child. And that's such an awesome thing to think about, that you've got a bunch of people on this podcast who've either had a couple of kids or who have a kid and are about to have another kid. There's proof positive just in a phone call with 4 people that a pregnancy with diabetes is extremely possible. There's so much hope to be gleaned from that if anyone's feeling like they want to dive into a bucket of popcorn and watch that Steele Magnolias movie and get down in the sads. Like I said, like that's fine, but there's so much hope and you don't have to look too far for it.
That's great. Melissa, anything that you'd like to add?
Yeah, I agree. I think that you have to be able to talk to your healthcare team, but you also have to be able to fire a healthcare team that doesn't give you respect about what your options are. And I think that that's sometimes a really hard decision to make. But if you're getting only one version of what your not yet existent pregnancy is going to be, and you're told, and it's always like this, and I won't let you this, and this is how and this is how it will be, then find another healthcare provider if you can. Not everyone has that option, but if you have that option, find people who will support you on your journey. I changed endocrinologists at the age of 23, 24, even though my pregnancy wasn't until I was 30, in part because I had a doctor who was so anti-pregnancy. Mm. And so finding a doctor that I could develop a relationship with where that was a card that was on the table was important. And I think sometimes we hear those experts in our head, and it can be really hard to question their judgment on that. And I'm not saying question your healthcare team's judgment, but do look for people who are supportive of your journey, which is one thing that I'd like to point out in the Steele Magnolias story. Shelby doesn't have anybody who is supporting her choices. She doesn't have anybody who is finding a way to get to yes for her. And that's one thing I think that also has bothered me about that tale for a long time is that, there's a lot of blame the victim. There's a lot of, we said no and you're not listening. You're being non-compliant kind of. And, it makes for a really heartbreaking, melodrama, but it doesn't, that's not the world anybody needs to exist in today. You need to have a team that is supporting you. And there's also a lot of great, there's Kerri's blog, there's Kerri's book, which is fantastic. My favorite book on pregnancy and with pre-existing diabetes is a book by Cheryl Alcon called Balancing Pregnancy and Pre-Existing Diabetes. Pretty cut and dry there. You can find all of these things, out there and read them. And there's other great books. Ginger's got a new book. There's lots of books coming out where, if you want to sit and read, or if you want to listen to podcasts, or if you, however you get your information, the information is out there now. JDRF even put together a really fantastic pregnancy toolkit. These are resources, like Kerri was saying, we didn't have when we were diagnosed, but they're there today.
I'll be sure to link all of that up. And Kyrra, I just got to ask, because your older child is so young, 16 months, what has her reaction been to you? Does she know that the baby's coming? Does she have any idea what's going on? I'm just curious as we let you go here, what she's thinking.
She has no clue. She has no clue what's going on. She's still in the stage where we're trying to teach her, body parts, and lately the big popular thing is a belly button. And so my belly button has been, I think a cause for concern because it just keeps looking weirder and weirder, So I have not even, we talk about babies, so she has no clue what's going on.
That's great.
But, I will say this is something after the first pregnancy, and I was on a pump for my first pregnancy, so the CGM, I was on Dexcom and a tandem pump, and I just was like Kerri and Melissa had mentioned, it's just, the stress and having so much pressure on you. It was insane by the time I had her that the day practically that I had her, I ripped them off and I could not have them on my body one more day. I was just over it. I was so overstressed from it. And I still have not put my pump back on since that first pregnancy. And plus holding a new baby, and I was like, I don't want to deal with the tubes, and there's already so much stuff, and I had gotten weird kind of scars from the first one. And so when I got pregnant with this one, I'm like, oh my gosh, I have to get back on the pump because she was healthy and that's what I needed to do. But I just couldn't bring myself to do it. And I said, you know what, when my A1Cs show that I need to get back on the pump, I will, but I still have it. And my A1C, and luckily, knock on wood, so far has been really good, but I've just been doing it entirely different with this pregnancy. So it's just interesting how, every time is different, and we'll see how this one goes too. But I will say, is on a positive note, because I think Melissa and Kerri already mentioned so many great resources. I can't compare it because obviously I've only ever been pregnant with diabetes, but I've had a great experience in the way that there are some positives about being diabetic and pregnant that I feel like I have gotten so much more information on my unborn child than so many of my other friends who have been pregnant, like just because we have more tests and there's more appointments and, we need these perinatal appointments that, monitor the heart rate, all these things that you're doing just because you are a high-risk pregnancy. I feel like I know my kid a little bit more than my other friends. I'm like, wait, you what test? What did you get? And I'm going, yeah. My doctor laughed at me today, and because we were leaving, and she goes, okay, you're free to go. And I'm like, wait, what about my blood work? What about the labs? And she goes, you're the only patient I have that asks for more tests to be done, And I'm like, I just like to have more information. It's just kind of fun. So for me, there are positives as well.
That's a great.
I love that, Kyrra. I had 18 sonograms with my daughter, and then I had over 20 with my son. Gosh. And it got to the point where they're like, "Do you want the pictures today?" And I'm like, "Does he look different than Tuesday?"
Exactly.
I always like when my friends who don't have diabetes are like, "Oh, did you do the glucose tolerance test?" And you can kind of go, "Nope, skip that one." And that's the only test you get to skip.
And I was going to ask about that, but then I felt like an idiot.
Oh, no, I brought it up.
Because I remember doing that and this is so gross and horrible. And then you feel kind of guilty, that's all I had to do.
Enjoy that.
When I went in, there was it wasn't my regular doctor, and he said something about, you're at this week, we need to schedule the glucose tolerance test. And I said, Doctor, did you check my file? Because I can tell you now I don't tolerate it well. And he was like, what?
Well, on that note, ladies, thank you so much for sharing this conversation. It's always great to talk about these issues with you. Your great sense of humor, but also really serious stuff. So thanks so much for spending some time with me. And I'd love to have you back on anytime. What a great round table. Thanks so much.
You're listening to Diabetes Connections with Stacey Sims.
More information on Kerri, Melissa, and Kyrra in the show notes. They are incredible women. I learn from them every time I open a blog or listen to an interview or follow them on social media. So I will definitely link up all the information on them. And they're so much fun to talk to. I love it. And I'll link up more information on our experiences last year with my local theater. They were really receptive to putting information on their website about pregnancy and type 1, to take nothing away from the play. The play is the story. The movie is the story. But if you take away, outdated information about type 1, that doesn't help anybody. So if you have that experience locally, because the play continues to be performed, I'd be happy to share what I did. And I've actually done that with a couple of listeners who've asked me, what did I do? How did I contact them? Because they've done that in their own local theater, which is amazing. So I'll link that up. I had some local news attention on it at the time, too. You can go to diabetes-connections.com or click on the show notes in any podcast app wherever you're listening. But, of course, all the information is at diabetes-connections.com every week. And if you're new to the show, please join the Facebook group. Love to have you. It's Diabetes Connections, the group, and it's a great place to come and learn more about the show. And I want to learn more about you, and we have great conversations there as well. I'll also link up the old episode. It's a little bit different. The interview is exactly the same, but I have no voice. I taped it in a hotel room. I was on the road. So if you want to hear me, not at my vocal prime, you can check that out as well. But I think in that episode, I'm also talking about Benny at camp last summer, and there's some other stuff that happened as well. All right, thank you to my editor, John Buchanan from Audio Editing Solutions. And we'll be back next week with our regularly scheduled episode, as we are every Tuesday. I'm Stacey Sims. I'll see you back here on Tuesday.
Diabetes Connections is a production of Stacey Sims Media. All rights reserved, all wrongs avenged.